Hey guys, you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. In today's episode, I'm going to be covering part 9 of my laminated oak kitchen tabletop guitar build. And as you can see, it's getting pretty close. I've got the neck glued into the body, and I've just masked off the fretboard in preparation for what I'll be talking about today, and that is leveling, crowning, and dressing the frets. So let me bring you in real close and I'll show you how I do this. This guitar is different than the oak kitchen tabletop guitar that I'm currently building. And the reason why I'm using this guitar is because I forgot to video the steps leading up to the point where I had masked off the fretboard. So I'm going to use this guitar. The process isn't any different. It's exactly the same no matter what guitar that I'm using. But the first thing I need to do is to make sure that my fretboard is absolutely dead flat level from the nut to the heel. And this is going to be done measured along the center line here. And I'm going to do that while the neck is unsupported. There's nothing holding the back of the neck, because anytime you put any sort of pressure up against this, it can change that reading. And even the slightest change can have an effect on the process of leveling. So I just keep it for the time being unsupported. And later on I'll add support as I start the leveling process. But the way I'm going to check the level is I'm going to use a notched straight edge, and this notched straight edge is two-sided. On this side I have a short guitar scale length, which is for your 24 3/4 inch scale, and then on this edge is the long guitar scale, which is typically your 25.5 inch scale length, which is what this guitar is. So what I'll do is I'll place the straight edge right roughly where the center line is, so that the frets pass through those notches. And what I'm doing is I am checking the level of the fretboard itself, not the tops of the frets. You don't want to do that because we haven't leveled the frets yet, so you would get an inaccurate reading. And there's also not enough there at each fret to really show you how level your fretboard is. But what I'm looking for is a gap between the bottom of the notched straight edge and the top of the fretboard, and that usually occurs around the 8th and 9th fret. You can see if the fretboard isn't level, it's either going to bow here, or you might, if it's bowing in the other direction, you'll have contact here, but then you'll have a gap at the ends. And that's what I'm looking for. I want to make sure there are no gaps, that there is consistent contact between the notched straight edge and the fretboard all the way along its length. And if there is a gap, I can adjust the truss rod to eliminate that gap. And in this case, the neck is pretty straight and level, so I'm good to go. But if there was a gap, you know, either at the center or at the ends, I could adjust the truss rod in either direction in very small increments while observing the relationship between the gap and how it diminishes as I adjust the truss rod. So once I have it completely level, I can then proceed with masking off the fretboard. So now I'll bring the oak laminated guitar back into this video and we'll continue. Now here's a tip. If you don't have a notched straight edge to check how level your fretboard is, what you can do is you can take a straight edge and place it right along the seam where the fretboard is laminated to the neck. And if it's bowed, you will either see a gap forming at the center or at the ends where that line isn't straight. And that's a way to see if you've got your fretboard level. And then of course you would again adjust that truss rod to make that seam line as straight as possible. When I first started learning how to build guitars, I was following the advice of a gentleman by the name of William Campagnano. And he and a guy by the name of Jonathan Nadelson have written this book, Guitar Making, Tradition and Technology. And this is actually probably one of the best books ever written on the subject of making acoustic guitars. It's really the classical reference that folks use. And I have one of the early editions of the book. And what they recommend is to use, I don't know if you can see that, a mill file to level the frets. And that's how I learned how to do it. I didn't realize at the time that there were specialized tools for leveling frets, so I used the mill file, and it actually works. The only problem is depending on how coarse it is, it can leave some pretty nasty tool marks in your frets, which can be a challenge to get rid of. So once I had some experience and knew a little bit more about what tools were available, I opted for a different approach. And that approach involved using a fret leveling beam. And these are really nice to use because they're inexpensive tools to make. It's just basically a bar of, well, it's not, I think it's hollow, steel rectangular tubing that has the two edges milled precision flat. And then you just attach your sandpaper to it and then proceed with leveling. It also has some fairly decent weight, so you don't have to press down. You can just use the weight of the tool itself to level the frets. And you can use whatever grit sandpaper you want to use. I prefer to use 240 grit. I know a lot of guys like to go finer, but I'm doing stainless steel frets, so I find 240 works pretty well for that. And I recommend that the beam be made out of steel. There are a lot of aluminum ones out there. Aluminum dings and nicks too easily. These steel ones, I think, are a much better tool to use because in any busy shop, tools are going to get dinged and banged around. So definitely go with steel. Now, the tool that I prefer to use is a 12-inch radiused, 30-inch long leveling beam. And I made this on my CNC machine using laminated pieces of maple, bone dry maple. And I carved the radius into it, and then I can attach my sandpaper, which again is 240 grit. And then all I have to do is lay it on the top. And as you can see, it's much longer than the fretboard itself. And the reason for that is because I also use this tool to fine-tune the radius on the fretboard before I glue it onto the neck. And I like to use a longer tool so that I have a pretty good, a long stroke length, which allows me to get the surface sanded faster. And then for leveling the frets, I can just set this on top and just a couple of light strokes back and forth and the frets will be level. Now I am considering making a new fret leveling beam specifically for just the purposes of leveling, because I don't necessarily think I need a beam this long. It's a bit cumbersome to work with. So I'm actually going to be making one. It'll be a smaller length, about 20 inches, which is slightly longer than my 25.5-inch scale fretboard. And it's going to be made out of aluminum. So that's something I'll probably cover in a video in the future. But for now, I'm going to be using this beam to do it. Now, the first thing I want to do, and this isn't absolutely necessary, it's kind of an option, but it's one that I recommend if you've never leveled frets before. And that is to mark just the very top of your frets with a Sharpie. And this is a commonly used technique. A lot of people talk about it. But what this does is it allows you to gauge your progress as you're doing the leveling. And what you're attempting to do here is sand off consistently the Sharpie from all the frets. And once you've done that, once all the frets have that Sharpie removed and you can see the flat spot that's been formed, you'll know your frets are level. And I'm using just a red Sharpie. It doesn't matter. I've had people actually argue with me about what color Sharpie you need to use for this, but that's just, you know, a typical example of how a lot of folks watching YouTube videos start to way overthink things to the point of it almost inhibiting your ability to function. Maybe I'll do a video on how to breathe. People will start to overthink that to the point where they're going to stop breathing. And maybe we can weed out some of the less desirable people. That's my diatribe for today. Okay, so with the frets marked, the next thing I have to do is I need to support the back of the neck. And with my table here, I have this fixture that I've created that allows me to set the neck in and support it. Because once I put that weight of that fret leveling radius sanding block on here, it's going to push the front of the neck down, and I don't want it to tip up or anything like that. So then I will set the beam right over the fretboard, and then it's just a matter of gently sliding it back and forth. The amplitude of the stroke is minimal, doesn't take much. But I can already see where I have removed the Sharpie from a few of the frets and from sections of other frets, which basically means I need to continue until all of that Sharpie is gone. Now, another thing I like to do is flip around the beam occasionally. That's just to cancel out any potential errors in the radius of the beam. Now, I don't think there are any, but since it's easy just to flip it around, it doesn't hurt to do that. And I'm not using any downward force here. I'm just using the weight of this block, which is considerable. I'd say it weighs somewhere around maybe 6-7 pounds. And then I'll check periodically to see if I am removing that Sharpie, and it's almost done. If you don't have a table like I've got to work on, one that supports both the body and the neck separately, you know, maybe you've just got a flat work surface to set your guitar on. What you can do to support the neck as you're leveling it is use one of these. This is just the leg of an old pair of jeans. And I cut off one end, sewed it up, and then filled it up with sand, and then sewed up the other end. And I can lay this on a table and then rest the neck on the top of this. And as long as it's not pushing up against the back of the neck, it makes a great support so that you can level the frets without the risk of bowing the neck under the weight of your fret leveling tool. Whenever I post videos about leveling frets, I always get two questions. The first is, how do I level the frets on a neck which has a compound radius fretboard? And the other is, do I account for fall off? Well, with respect to that first question, yes, I do level frets on a compound radius fretboard. However, the process and the technique is pretty complicated, and it's really outside the scope of this video. Maybe down the road I'm gonna have to do a video where I talk about that. That way, whenever somebody asks the question, I can just send them to that video. With respect to fall off, first of all, let me explain what fall off is. Fall off is when you level the frets so that from roughly the 15th fret to your last fret is at a very slight downward angle. What that does is it means that from about the 15th fret, your 16th fret would be slightly lower than the 15th fret. The 17th fret would be slightly lower than the 16th fret, and so on all the way up to the end. The reason is the strings at this part of your fretboard are going to be vibrating more than they do anywhere else on your scale length. So luthiers like to grind those last frets down at a slight angle towards the bridge so that that amplitude of vibrating oscillation isn't causing string buzz at the upper frets. I only do that in certain situations. If the scale length is going to be shorter than, say, 25.5 inches, or if the neck is going to be angled with respect to the bridge, or if I know that the person who's going to be playing the guitar is going to be doing alternate tunings which might reduce the string tension, then I'll add fall off. Otherwise, if the neck is flat to the body, if the scale length is longer than 25.5 inches, and if the guitar player never plans to do anything other than standard tuning, I don't bother with adding fall off in. It just doesn't matter. And in the case of this guitar, since it's 25.5 inch scale and the neck is flat relative to the body, I'm not going to worry about adding in any fall off. But if I were going to, what I would do is I would simply angle the sanding beam as I'm sanding this area. And I do that by layering 3 or 4 strips of masking tape on top of my 15th fret. That raises up the sanding blocks so that when I'm sanding, it's going to be attacking those upper frets at a slight angle. And once I've broken through that tape down to the fret, I know that I've got my fall off sanded into those upper frets. So, but I'm not going to do that for this particular guitar. Perhaps in a future video, I'll show how I've done that. So that's basically the answer to those 2 questions. Okay, as you can see, after leveling, the fretboard is pretty grimy, which is obviously why I mask it off. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my vacuum and suck my fretboard. And then I'm going to go back and mark the tops of my fret wire again. And the reason for that is because I'm going to recrown the frets, and I will use that red Sharpie mark as a way to gauge my progress as I am forming the crown. The tool I like to use for fret crowning is a Nicholson 6-inch slim taper 3-corner file. And I took this to my bench grinder and I ground off the sharp edges where the teeth from each side met, and that creates a safe edge so that I don't gouge my fretboard. I also rounded over the corners and the edges at the end of the file. Now, I don't typically file down at this end of the file, so it really isn't necessary to do it. It's just sort of an extra safety precaution. But over the years, I've used different kinds of crowning tools, like these toothed crowning files. You can get these on eBay and Amazon. My favorite, though, is this StewMac file. This has diamond, and it works really well to form the crown. The only problem is with the stainless steel, it did wear out pretty fast, and these files are pretty expensive. So I just keep going back to using my Nicholson slim taper file. And the technique is pretty simple. You just place the file with the one side, flat side straight up, so that the angle is against the fret itself. And then you just begin and gradually round the file over as you're filing. And as you're doing this, you'll see the Sharpie is getting worn away. And I'll work both sides of the fret as I do this. And what ends up happening is that Sharpie gets narrower until it becomes just a thin strip. It's pretty simple. And once I have that thin Sharpie strip, I know that fret has been recrowned. Another tool that I like to use and I recommend is one of these stainless steel fretboard protectors. This is just a thin strip of stainless steel that has a slot cut in it that you can fit over the fret. And this one in particular has a handle which makes it easy and convenient to hold. And I just place it over the fret, and then I will proceed with crowning. And that protects the fretboard from damage. Now when it comes to dressing the ends of the frets, I like to use the Stuart McDonald 1175 dressing file. And this is a really small file with super fine teeth, and it's got a flat safe edge and then a rounded safe edge. So it's not going to damage the fretboard. Now I typically will only use a dressing file when I'm dressing the ends of stainless steel frets. If I'm working with nickel silver, I'll just bevel the edges, and then later on as I'm sanding out the file and leveling scratches, I can usually get it to take care of the ends of the frets and get them nice and smooth and take off the sharp edges. The technique that I use for dressing the ends of the fret with this little micro dressing file is pretty straightforward and simple. I'll take the flat safe edge and place that right down on the fretboard so that the teeth of the file are right up against the fret parallel. And then I'll place my finger against the file just to give it a little bit of support and control. Then I'll begin to file, and then as I do this, I will slowly angle the file and then return. Then I'll go to the other side and do the same thing. Then what I'll do is I will roll the file over the top of the fret and down the other side. And I'll continue to do this while at the same time changing the angle. What this will do is it's going to remove the sharp edge between the angled face of the end of the fret and the rest of the fret. But what it will do is it will replace that sharp edge with what I would describe as faceted edges, sort of like when you cut a diamond. Now obviously we want to try to remove those for the sake of aesthetics. That'll happen later on as I am removing the tool marks left by both my crowning file as well as this dressing file, and then as I continue through the polishing process. Well, at this point, I have finished leveling, crowning, and dressing the frets. And logic would dictate the next step would be to remove all the tool marks that were left by my crowning and dressing file. And then I would polish the frets. However, I prefer to leave that step to the very end. It will be one of the last things that I do as I finish this guitar. So until then, what I need to do is install the tuners, make the nut, install the bridge, the pickups, the electronics. Then I'll string up the guitar, set the action, tune the strings, intonate them, and as long as everything goes according to plan, which I anticipate it will, then I'll be able to go back in, remove those tool marks, and polish up the frets, which means at that point the guitar will be completely finished. I'm not sure if that's going to happen in the next episode or the episode after that, or maybe even the episode after that. It just depends on how each step of this process goes. So until the next episode, hopefully you've found this video to be useful and will maybe inspire you to do some of your own fretwork. At any rate, I hope you got something out of this and are willing to give my video a thumbs up. That always helps. And as always, head over to eGuitar Plans to show me some support and purchase a plan for a guitar or one of the tools that I use to build guitars. And until the next episode, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.